Welcome to the Pinocchio Project. This is your host, Mitch Friedman. And in this episode, I'm going to continue our conversation that I began in episode 1 a couple weeks ago about virtue. I thought I'd do something different, however. Instead of just talking categorically or generally about definitions of virtue, I thought I would give you a conversation that juxtaposes virtue with its opposite, and that's vice. And so I've titled this episode of Vice and Virtue. As we talked about in episode 1, virtue, the definition generally is behavior showing high moral standards. And from a Christian worldview perspective, we talk a lot about where those standards come from. They're not subjective, meaning everybody decides what's right on their own. But our moral standards are given to us by the one who created us, our God, our Creator, who knows what's best for us and how we flourish. He has given us a template for flourishing as to how we should behave with each other, in families, in culture, so that human flourishing is at its optimum. So virtue is defined as behavior showing high moral standards. Its antithesis, its opposite, its antonym is vice. And appropriately enough, vice is immoral or wicked behavior. So virtue, behavior showing high moral standards; vice, immoral or wicked behavior. And so instead of a categorical list of what virtues are and vices are as opposite, I thought I would give you a little exercise of observation, and I would say interpretation, using a worldview grid that has a biblical framework. There's an old expression: if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And our goal on the Pinocchio Project is not so much that I would sit here and be a talking head and just provide all the articles of worldview development from my own experience and my own training and just feed them to you for a day. But our desire is to equip you to examine everyday ideas that promise human flourishing, so that you can begin to examine for yourself whether or not these promises and these propositions of flourishing are trustworthy and reliable. And there are a lot of ideas in culture that promise flourishing, and we would say from a biblical perspective are delivering anything but. The opposite of flourishing is degrading. So to flourish is to grow in a healthier, vigorous manner, particularly as a result of a favorable environment. And so what I want to do today, I want to walk through a statement that's a celebration speech of last year's Transgender Day of Visibility. And the one giving the celebratory speech, which has moral implications, it has virtue implications, it has vice implications. The speech is actually given by our current sitting president, Joe Biden, who has his own history of supporting virtue and vice in this very area of what it means to be human in sexual ethics. And at this point in his career, he has pretty much bowed the knee to the sexual orthodoxy that tells us that virtue lies in expressing yourself however it is you feel you should express yourself sexually. And so on this Transgender Day of Visibility from last year, which was in March of 2022, I'm going to read to you, we're going to walk through it slowly, and I'm going to ask you to engage your brain so you can filter this language for appropriate evaluation and whether or not our president, Joe Biden, is promoting virtue or vice. One of the things about our current culture is we have now made unquestionable things that even 10 or 15 years ago were unthinkable as behavior or virtue. And now it seems that we are calling vice virtue and virtue vice, or vice versa and vice versa. And so from the lawn of the White House in March of last year, here is a transcript of Joe Biden's address on the Transgender Day of Visibility. And I'm going to pause along the way, and I want you to examine with me what language is being used, what propositions and ideas are being promoted regarding what is virtuous and what is vice. What you need to know if you're a parent is that this is the steady diet that your children are receiving in public schools, in their feeds, on social media. And so this should be a wake-up call for you if you haven't woken up already. I'm encouraging you to get woke in the right direction so you can be prepared personally, and then you can shepherd your children also appropriately towards what flourishing really looks like. So, March of last year, on the lawn of the White House, from our president. To everyone celebrating Transgender Day of Visibility, I want you to know that your president sees you. Jill, that's his wife, Kamala, vice president, Doug, that's his staff, and our entire administration sees you for who you are, made in the image of God. Now, what I'd like to point out is that I'm in total agreement that every human being is made in the image of God. That's the essence of a biblical worldview, that we are made in the image of God. And so right off the bat, the president uses religious language that many of us have heard and would agree with on its face, that we are made in the image of God, to begin to set the framework and the favorable environment for what he would describe as flourishing. We see you for who you are, made in the image of God and deserving of dignity, respect, and support. I also agree. As a Christ follower, I'm commanded to show everyone made in his God's image, which is everyone, dignity, because we have inherent dignity as image bearers, and respect and support. And so the soil continues to be prepared for the blooms and the blossoms of what Joe is going to describe as virtuous living. But we know it's hard when there are those out there who don't see you and don't respect you. And this is the definition of what it means to not be respected and to be invisible. For example, the onslaught, moral language. It's very important that as you equip yourself for messages coming from culture, you begin to recognize the intensity of language that's geared to support propositions that promise flourishing. For example, the onslaught of anti-transgender state laws attacking you and your families is simply wrong. So to paraphrase, any pushback on this notion that I decide for myself, within myself, as I look inside myself, who I am from a gender perspective, regardless of biology, regardless of physiology, any pushback on my personal decision is a vice, and it's an attack. And any policy making is seen as an onslaught of bias that is meant to deprive me of dignity and respect. The onslaught of anti-transgender state laws attacking you and your families is simply wrong. I'll also point out, just from a national community perspective, this kind of language from our president, pitting state against state, does nothing to foster what I would call a common vision for what flourishing should be across our land, and continues to disperse us into tribal identities. This administration is standing up for you against all these hateful bills. More language pointing out the vice of anyone, the immoral behavior, the wicked behavior of anyone who would push back against this notion of autonomous self-determination. You see this, don't you? And we're committed to advancing transgender equality in the classroom. I'll say, I'm not sure if you're aware, if your kids go to public school, you should be aware. You can get samples of curricula that are responsible to promote these agendas. But it's a steady stream. It's a torrent. It's a fire hydrant of sorts. And these are authorities. Teachers are authority figures. Schools are places of institutional authority. We're committed to advancing transgender equality in the classroom, on the playing field. Yes, on the playing field, and we've seen that. We've seen biological men insist that they have a chance to compete against biological women, and biological men are inherently superior from a physical standpoint. And one of the outcomes downstream of this allowance of biological males to compete as biological females from a collegiate level is that biological females are being deprived of scholarship opportunities. You should be aware of all these realities that are based in non-realities. On the playing field, at work, and in our military, in our housing, and in our healthcare systems. Now, you've heard me talk about this on the Pinocchio project before. Anytime I take a healthy body part, such as what needs to be done in gender affirming, these are euphemisms, gender affirming surgery, healthcare is the practice of making non-functioning or diseased parts of my body functional and working properly again. And to say healthcare is what's necessary to make healthy body parts either remade or removed is an absolute deception. I know you see this. In our housing and our healthcare systems everywhere, simply everywhere. And today, we're announcing even more steps. But there's always more work to do. So when it comes to promoting virtue and fighting wickedness and vice, there's always more to do. And at the end of this epidemic of violence against transgender women of color and girls of color, so that we can ensure transgender seniors. So now the whole net is thrown out to include everybody. So that everyone who claims a transgender identity, girls and women of color, seniors, which I'm not even aware of the demographic of the folks that are aging in our country, how many of those folks claim this transgender identity. But what's happening here is the garden or the soil of flourishing is being promoted so that every person can bloom and blossom in this soil of personal autonomy. Let me start over with that. But there's always more work to do to end the epidemic of violence against transgender women of color and girls of color. Now, I don't know about this epidemic of violence. I don't know what this means. Is it the pushback by policymaking that insists that biology should lead and physiology is the first sorter of gender? Is that the violence? Is it actual physical violence where roving bands of people who are binary and cisgender are walking the streets looking for someone who's identifying outside their biological gender so they can smack them down? I doubt that. Let me start over again. But there's always more work to do to end the epidemic of violence against I'm sorry. You see the intensity of this moral language. Onslaught, attack, hateful, epidemic of violence. I'm going to start over one more time. But there's always more work to do to end the epidemic of violence against transgender women of color and girls of color. Well, where are the transgender men of color and boys of color? I don't know. I just don't know. Maybe he just forgot to include everybody, boys and girls, if there are such a thing. If there even are such a thing in this garden, in this soil. Okay, I'm going to start over one more time. But this is probably the thickest worldview-rich observational paragraph in this whole speech. But there's always more work to do to end the epidemic of violence against transgender women of color and girls of color to ensure transgender seniors can age with dignity, and to finally now pass a bipartisan Equality Act. And if you don't know about the Equality Act, you should. Maybe I'll do an episode on the Equality Act that has never gained much traction in our policymakers, either the House or the Congress, or the House or the Senate. But we're probably getting closer. And to finally pass a bipartisan Equality Act to help transgender persons around the world. So now the United States is going global with this agenda. We want to be seen as the leaders in this movement for dignity, equality, to end the epidemic of violence. Now, this is virtue signaling. See, virtue is moral behavior. Virtue signaling is taking moral language and throwing a blanket of promise so that we can be seen as the heroes and the champions of this cause. To finally pass a bipartisan Equality Act to help transgender persons around the world live free from discrimination and violence. Now listen carefully, parents. Above all, to be there with you. And to parents of transgender children, affirming your child's identity is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep them safe and healthy. So put that necessity in your parenting toolbox. Affirm your child's identity. The identity that may be proclaimed from a 6-year-old psyche that's not even old enough to understand what it means to choose well for dinner. To parents of transgender children, affirming your child's identity is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep them safe and healthy. To any transgender American who's struggling, please know you're not alone. To parents and children alike, please ask for help. And here he goes in the close. More virtue. And know this, you're so brave. You belong, and we have your back. And let's now bring the transcendent reality, the transcendent identity to put the seal of approval on this whole speech. God bless you all. Be brave. I'm going to put a link to this speech in the show notes. And if you're really interested in training yourself to identify this virtue signaling that is calling virtue vice and vice virtue, then you should acquaint yourself, spend time with these arguments. And as we've said before, and I'm teaching an introduction to worldview class in the church I'm privileged to serve right now, most of our worldview dysfunction is rooted in the first essential question of every worldview development. What does it mean to be human? And the perspective of this speech is that what it means to be human is that regardless of what I see in the mirror, regardless of the realities of my physiology, what it means to be human is no matter how old I am or how mature I am or how much experience I have in the slings and arrows of outrageous living, what it means to be human is I have the absolute autonomy from my emotional, psychological self. I have the autonomy and the freedom, autonomos. I am a law unto myself. I have the autonomy and even the responsibility, which is a ton of pressure, by the way, especially on your children, to identify who I am or who I am not, or if I am at all anyone of any gender. And the confusion and the chaos reigns. This is a worldview of vice, not virtue. So I'm going to link this speech in the show notes. It came off of Yahoo News back in March of 2022. And I'd love to get some feedback from you. Believe me, as an image bearer who's fallen, I'm still living in this tent of sin. I have my own struggle with vice and virtue. But when we accelerate as a people the planting of a garden in soil that insists that vice is virtue, our fruit will be nothing but toxic. For the Pinocchio Project, this is Mitch Friedman signing off.